Well, greetings and welcome to week 5. This is lecture 2. This is building on this idea of missional leadership that we began last week and that we carried into this first lecture of this week, in which we looked at those 5 characteristics of a missional leader, which is integrity, vision, courage, compassion, and humility. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about my own leadership development in terms of how I've played this out and how it's worked itself out within the context of a number of different situations. So I've pastored and been a part of a staff at 3 different churches. The first church that I was at was in Clarksville, Tennessee. We had shifted from what I would consider a traditional sort of conservative evangelical Nazarene church to a very missionally minded church that really saw itself as standing out on the edge in a very broken community of about 160,000 people in Clarksville, Tennessee, where we began to embrace the least, the last, and the lost. And we began to create space for them to show up and to find their place to call home. And I can tell you story after story of the amazing and glorious ways that we saw that take place. But I can also tell you the story of the heartache and the heartbreak of watching people walk out of the door because of their discomfort with what that was going to mean for them and the way that was going to mess up what they thought they had going in their own personal space of the congregation that they thought that they were a part of. But then I made a shift, and so I went from this church that was really sort of standing on the edge, a town of 160,000 to a community of 2,000 in a church of about 200, 250. And I want to tell a specific story regarding this. So this church that I was moving into had a long history, 100-year-old history within this community. It was a healthy history. It was a history in which this church had consistently made investments in the next generation. They had an incredible ministry amongst the youth and the teens even before I got there. I was the third pastor in 55 years. They'd done a tremendous work of just consistently investing back in the school system. We had a number of teachers that were a part of our church. We had brought in a young leader. She was a pastor. She was there prior to my arrival. She'd intentionally moved into the projects to live there and amongst those children that were in that community within the governmental housing there in the community, so that she could invest and be a part of their lives just outside the 4 walls of the church. She was a dynamic and amazing young lady. We had a pastor who had grown up in that town, the youth pastor, who had his fingers and hands into every element. And then when our children's pastor transitioned, we brought in another couple of children's pastors who did a phenomenal job of connecting with the youth and the children throughout the community. We had a Wednesday night program, and our Wednesday night program was running about 120 kids every week in a town of 2,000 people, right? In a county of 8,000 people, we had 120 kids. I think they have about 170, 190 at this point. And this all plays into where I'm going with this story. So I am deeply committed to recovery ministries because that's been a part of my story, and I see the benefit of it. I see the absence of it nearly in every community that I enter into. This idea of taking seriously the healing and the wholeness from hurts, habits, and hangups that have been a part of people's lives throughout. And so I've sought to want to embody this sort of recovery mindset and this recovery framework within the concept of the church, and creating that safe space for people to find not only Christ, but healing from their addictions and their compulsions. And so when I entered into this church, I said, I want to bring this recovery ministry, Celebrate Recovery, to the church. And I'd really told them that from the get-go as a part of my interview process. And I knew that was going to be a hard sell because in that community, people tend to keep their cards pretty close to their chest. It's not like they want to be outed for the struggles that they have and the things that they endure. And so they're a little bit more shy about what we do and how we get there, right? And so I knew that I was called to be a missional change agent. There was also a sense that we're pretty comfortable in who we are and what we do. We've got a sense of money. We've got a great thing going. We don't necessarily always want to disrupt things. And I knew that I was being called there to be a missional change agent. And these people were malleable, right? So these are folks that weren't resistant to it. They just needed the encouragement and the development. So there was an investment mutual. And I can't say enough good about this church. So I don't want to make it appear like I was moving into a really hard and difficult situation. These are great people whose perspective on the church or on the faith was a little bit narrow. And so what they were longing for is an expansion or a broadening of that horizon. And so we began to explore that and the places we would connect, the investments we would make. I started coaching high school football so that I could make inroads to the community. I was on the Bethesda mission, which was the mission there in community to help the poor and the homeless and those who were dealing with major financial issues and crisis. And we were investing, and people were coming to the church from that. that, and we were starting to pick up people from the group home that was in our town, and there was just some really great dynamics. And so about 3 years in, 4 years in, no, about 3 years in at this point, three and a half, I had approached them and said, okay, over this next year, I want to begin to talk about developing this idea of not only a recovery center, but really this sort of redemption ministry in which we would rent a facility, we would have counselors, we would have recovery ministries, we would have group therapy sessions. We would really try to create an avenue in our community which was riddled by alcoholism and drug abuse and domestic abuse and poverty and the poverty mindsets that become entrenched in that. And I really felt like this was an opportunity for our community to make a serious investment into the life of the broader community that we found ourselves in. And I felt like we had the resources and we had the personnel. We had a trained counselor. We had someone who's trained in Celebrate Recovery. We had people ready and poised to make that kind of investment. So for about a year, I worked the methodology of change. In my mind, I knew where we needed to go. I had the vision to see where we needed to go, and I took the intentional steps of leading us and directing us to get there. And there are intentional steps that we're going to walk through in Lecture 3. And I started taking those intentional steps. And I started meeting with my key leaders. I would show up at their work and bring them lunch and have conversations and field questions. We would discuss it throughout our board meetings. I would lead devotionals that would speak to it. I would preach series that would start to prime the pump on this. And about a year in, after a year of work, of working this change agent mentality, we get to the point at which we're now at the board meeting in which we're going to vote whether or not to pull the trigger on developing this ministry of renting a property, of taking these steps. And that's when all of the questions broke loose. And everybody had concerns or questions or issues or wondered how this would affect and impact how people might see us as a church. Where are they safe? Will people know too much about what's going on in their life because you can't hide in a community of 2,000 people? All of these questions, I remember sitting there and I had a really good rapport and really good relationship with them. I said, where were these questions for the last year? I've been showing up and asking you to tell me what are you dealing with? And one of them said, we love you, we appreciate you, we know that you're a praying pastor, we don't want to stand against what you feel called to or the vision that you feel called to lead us toward. And they said, so that was a bit of our reluctance in taking these steps. And then I had one of the ladies, one of the key voices on the board, she raised her hand, she said, listen, I believe Pastor Jeff is a praying man, so I'm not going to stand against his vision, so I'm going to vote for this, even if I have trouble seeing it. And I said, hold up, wait a minute, that is not how this works. This is where the collaborative leadership, I think, really works. And for me, this was a test of my humility, but also a test of my courage. And I said, okay, that's not how this is going to work. We're not going to buy into this just because I say so, because then you won't have any buy-in to it. And I said, so we're not going to take a vote today. I said, I'm not going to do this on the back end of so many questions and so much difficulty in trying to figure out. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to commit to 40 days of prayer. Next month, we're not going to have board meeting. We're going to have prayer meeting. And so we're going to gather in the sanctuary together. We're going to pray. This word is going to get out to our congregation because they're going to know that this is what's happening. And I said, so in a couple weeks, we're going to have a stand of solidarity as a leadership team. And we're going to gather in front of the congregation. We're going to share our hearts with them. And we're going to sing a song together, one of the hymns together, so that they can see that we are in this together. And at the end of 40 days, in our next board meeting, we're going to have a vote. And whatever way that vote goes, that's the direction we're going to go as a church. And I said, I'm submitting to that as well. I'm submitting to the work of the Holy Spirit that's happening in here. And so 40 days of prayer and really intentionality and conversations and prayer. And we come back at the end of 40 days and it was time for a vote. And as we sat there, I said, is there anybody that wants to give voice to concerns or questions before we take this vote? And one of the people said, hey, listen, we've got such an amazing ministry to teens and children throughout this church. And this is really the place that God has given us. And we're afraid that if we launch into this new endeavor, it takes so many man hours to do the kind of work that we're doing with the children and youth. Our building's constantly open for them. We're constantly investing in new opportunities and activities. We've even talked about adding on at some point for our children. And we're just afraid that if we step into this, that it's going to steer us away from the direction that God has already called us to. And I was honestly resistant to that idea. I was like, no, we can do both. both. We've got the people who are trained, who have the capacity to do both. And there was pushback about finances and about how much that would take away from our ability to really minister to the teens in that community and to the kids in that community. And eventually I had one of my board members, and I thought this was a turning point for our meeting. He stands up and he says, listen, if we shoot this idea of Pastor Jeff down because we are doing the work with the children and youth, then what we are effectively saying is that every one of us on this board has now just volunteered to help with our children and youth. Because if we are that committed to keeping this continually and consistently engaged with our children and youth, we all have to be buying in, not only with our ideas and our mouths, but with our money and our time. And that was the game changer in that meeting. And we voted, and they voted me down, and I lost. But did I? That really becomes the question, right? Because I had a vision, and I still believe in that vision in that community. I still believe that vision needs to happen in the community. But as I led and empowered, sometimes when you empower, decisions are made outside of you, right? And I think that's important. That sometimes you're with them, not standing over them, dictating and determining. And so at the end of that, when they voted, we went the direction that the board wanted to go. And I didn't see that as a failure of my leadership. In fact, I saw that as an opportunity for me to grow to a leader into what I would learn as a leader amongst other leaders. And I will tell you, all of them began to volunteer in the children's and youth ministry. And since I left, that ministry has exploded and grown. They've started an upward soccer program. They did build a building so that they could extend their opportunity to minister to youth and teens. They've made some financial and some staffing shifts to make themselves better suited to minister to the children and teens. And I just want to tell you, an amazing thing has happened when the board made a commitment to a vision that we collectively participated in. Now, again, I still would love to see that church eventually do that ministry, but I wanted to trust that God was at work more than just Jeff driving the ship and making something happen. So in terms of missional leadership and in terms of missional change agent, I wanted to give you that personal story because I'm about to illustrate a few techniques and tactics that we can begin to explore in terms of how this begins to flesh itself out in some very practical ways. So hopefully maybe that story gave you a picture of missional leadership, of trying to move a church forward, but also submitting and surrendering to the work of the Spirit of God within the church as a whole.